Is this one working? Yes. Thank you, the organizers, for inviting me this year as well. I'm very happy to getting a chance to contribute. I'm perhaps part of that generation that saw the way in which mechanisms of prevention were first established in the 90s, facing those wars that or conflicts that emerged from the reconfiguration of what was then the world under the Soviet Union and the Balkans. And therefore, I remember quite vividly those debates about the OSCE. At that time, people were joking in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, they were translating OSCE. We just came OSCE after the CSE as the organization for supporting the election of Clinton. It was another era, of course. And the idea was at that point truly one of thinking, and I completely agree with what I just heard, in terms of a pan-European mechanism that would address multidimensional issues. And back then, I was a researcher. I was comparing Kosovo and Crimea. Kosovo was the failed case of prevention, and the Crimea was the successful case of prevention. It had been addressed through the OSCE in 95, 96, after a peak in separatism in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, following the establishment of a presidency for the Republic and the big acrimonious dispute between Kiev and Simferopol, backed by Moscow back then. Why am I recalling this? Because I think there is a kind of overall logic, which perhaps as an academic, I would like to stretch or at least to map out, which is one of how far can we realistically go in understanding the importance and the success in preventive action into institutionalized routines, mechanisms, procedures, which are somehow emerging in the interlocking, sometimes interblocking architecture of security in Europe and elsewhere in Africa. And I think there's something which struck me over the past few years, which is why I was, as an academic, as a researcher, strongly opposed to those realist-minded scholars. I'm thinking about a prominent professor in this university on the North American side, William Zartman, his idea of ripeness for prevention, which is the one moment in the cycle of conflict where conflict is amenable to management and mitigation with an eye to preventing an escalation and instilling some form of more constructive course of, if not resolution, at least settlement. And this is perhaps belonging to handbooks, the idea that conflict tends to have a modal development. We have gone through a couple of decades of conflicts that were long, protracted, sporadic, opportunistic. We even have a literature on new wars, somehow challenging the previous Clausewitzian understanding of war as a clash of willingness over one main front line, and understanding war as a system, more as a system, heavily criminalized, and somehow not teleologically bound anywhere. But I don't want to do anything in that direction. I would like just to say whether over the past 30 years, people like who are back to the big debate, not only among international relations scholars, I'm thinking about John Mearsheimer, who's back on the front page of the newspapers, prominent neorealist, who claims to have warned us about the fact that we would be at war on Ukraine. I'm talking about the very same person who in 1991 in a famous article proposed selective proliferation of nukes, of nuclear weapons, to creating different kind of equilibrium that would prevent us from being where we stand today. So there's a bit of a kind of bitter sense whereby those neorealist authors, especially those working in offensive realism, were for about 20 years somehow sidelined in the debate, and liberal institutionalism, which underpins much of the idea of rolling prevention in mechanisms that are those that we have discussed, were prevalent at least in the diplomatic debate, well, they're taking a sort of their revenge intellectually. They're back with a vengeance on the newspaper saying, we told you so, we're against the invasion of Iraq, and we're rightly so, not for moral reasons, but out of a kind of clear, theoretically driven understanding of the nature of international relations. That's the way to go about prevention. That's the argument that resonates. It's not by putting effort in building peace from below, creating institutions and so on. Now, if one looks into the structure of that argument, it's an argument which is flawed on so many ways. And this flaws mainly because it cannot explain change in international relations. If I had to select one aspect, we could go into more complex debates there. It's wrong because of a number of factual elements that we have seen in the way even this war, the war in Ukraine, deflagrated, which starting from its own timing, that war could have started under Trump's presidency with a completely different outcome for Moscow, most likely. And why waiting for having a new president committed to democracy and intervention? It's something that there are so many things that are incongruous there. But it is a fact that when we talk about structural prevention and you think about structure as a IR specialist, you think about the structure of the international system. And, you know, if you want to take a poetical note, you can say something on the realist side. You can take Bertolt Brecht and the idea that love, like war, always finds its way. There's no point in trying to prevent it. You can only try to mitigate it, to mitigate the security dilemmas by understanding the rules of the game out there. So I think one of the problems we have in discussing prevention is a problem which has been called, is the problem that defining success is problematic because of a question of scale. Are we talking about electoral post-election violence domestically? Are we talking about nuclear escalation and tactical weapons? Are we talking about dispute resolution in the Sahel among shepherds and pastoralists and local agriculture, the Songhai and the Pearl? What is the scale and what kind of actors are we talking about? But we tend sometimes, perhaps out of parsimony, perhaps out of excessive simplification, to conflate everything into one single basket and think of prevention as a function that applies from our personal life to thermonuclear war. I think it's a problem that from a theoretical and a methodological point of view, and I don't have the time now to break it down into different levels and elements of analysis. But I believe that if we want to build an argument in favor of prevention and against that idea that prevention is possible only at a certain point where the parties are exhausted and the conflict reaches a plateau, and therefore a mediator can help preventing further escalation. If we want to avoid the cynicism of those who think that energy put in prevention is wasted diplomacy, we have to wait for that moment. I think we need to have a theory of change. And that's something which is a bit missing in a number of contexts. It's missing in the Sahel. Someone mentioned 18 strategies for the Sahel. I was recently at the meeting of the special envoys, and there was, and I was discussing that with others, a question of understanding what is the underlying theory of change that guides our attempts at preventing, at intervening through development or through security provision. And there's a bit of a giving up to the fact that the world is complex, and even those few things upon which there is a certain degree of agreement, the fact that if structurally speaking, we have a world that is more democratic in a consolidated manner, institutionally rich, more symmetric economically, and with less poverty, we probably have a world which is much less violent in terms of fundamentals of peace than if we have a world that is based on autocracy, protectionism, big speculative financial schemes, and authoritarian regimes. That there's very little dispute about that, even among hard-nosed realists. The problem is how to get there. The problem is how to understand the conditions that are missing in the international system, given the lack of overarching governance mechanisms. So, if we I think if we need, and I'm trying to just translate that on an empirical case of Ukraine today, so that I don't tire you more than too much. If I look at Ukraine today, there are a few things that struck me. Not only in terms of the, let's say, cognitive trauma that many of us suffered in seeing that happening. After there was a conflict, but the escalation that went immediately virally horizontal and vertical is something that few analysts expected to happen in the way it happened. Okay, I remember to talk about the European Union. We talk about the European Union, which has mechanism for addressing, of course, early warning and so on. The first international moment of discussion under the French presidency was a gathering on the Indo-Pacific while Russia was invading. So there was a total disconnect between the big diplomatic track or foreign policies and what was going on in a conflict that had been festering for a long time. And some of the things that strike me there are, one is the difficulty in understanding that the escalation that is taking place is fundamentally driven by ideological propulsion. Even the idea of preventing conflict from getting worse by escalating it militarily, which seems to be behind, let's say, on both sides, some of the recipes. Let's go to a level up after which we can try to contain a number of issues, because it is understood quite clearly who is going to prevail. That situation is one which is based on an idea of deterrence, which is based on secrecy, and that is based on showing determination. You don't have deterrence if you don't show that you are resolute and determined. The more you show determination, and the most extreme case is the use of nuclear wars, tactical nukes, which makes no sense. If you say, I have tactical nukes, but I'm not going to use it. No, you have to say you use it and you will use it, and you will be very clear about using it. And everybody's saying, no, there's no point in using that in a conflict that is spread, where there is no advancing column. Technically speaking, militarily speaking, there is no reason. But there was no reason also through our scheme of rationality to understand an invasion on February 24th. So what was that about? It was about showing conviction, determination in reshaping the world order based on changing some of the principles that are those principles that are enshrined in the OSCE, understanding of what are minorities, their right against the right of non-intervention, and so on and so forth. So if the entire conflict is today based on the idea of showing determination, resolution, and going all the way down, and that's very clear in the Kremlin at least, then there is a risk of further escalation. If on the other side, and I'm talking about the most painful thing probably, which is what happened in north of Kiev, to avoid panicking, people were not evacuated. And there's a lot of speculation about why were people not evacuated there, but they were evacuated elsewhere. And that ended up in atrocities that we have seen, upon which there is investigation. Let's hope the investigation continues, and that give us a sense of where that violence was directed and who is responsible. Then I am afraid that we are on a path of further escalation, where unless we address the ideological gasoline, we are not in a situation of safety in terms of where this is all going. That is, I believe, a problem that we're not going to address through the existing mechanisms of prevention. Why? And I want to conclude on this. Because if something I have seen, and I'm very happy if someone demonstrates that I'm wrong, is that the whole idea of prevention as it has been practiced so far is based on very noble and important principles of data acquisition, transparency, processing, validation, public audit, and so on and so forth. Which is a bit like what we do in the academia. We produce a scientific stuff, it goes through peer review, we publish that, it's public, but then when it comes to foreign policy and that idea of escalation and unilateral action and so on, who takes the floor is a different kind of subject, which is intelligence, which by definition is secret or highly confidential. It's strategic studies, not political science. It's not conflict analysts, not peace activists. Strategic studies, it's war schools, it's lobbying, it's think tanks. So there is a bit of a divide, when we talk about prevention. There's a prevention which is driven by political imperatives that are part of the world of security, and if you go into authoritarian regimes, securocrats, talk about the Kremlin and so on, a bit less in the West and under democratic headings. And there is a world that we want very much to be strong, to see stronger, which is represented here at the table and this room, which would like prevention to be something subject to public scrutiny, whereby in a more Kantian world, there is no state secret. If force is being accumulated somewhere, it is publicly disclosed, and there is a way of understanding whether that trend, even by using an algorithm, is leading to some dangerous point of rupture of peace. I think these two tracks in this moment are not reconciled. And I think Ukraine is a case. I mean, all of those like me who studied on the Crimea and on the vagaries of transition in Ukraine didn't use intel sources and had one picture which is different from the picture that we see every day. That doesn't make me sleep very comfortable. Thank you.